Good evening. I'm Mark. Welcome to Nate Sutan. If you've been joining us for the past couple of episodes, we've been covering certain sections of the Gnostic Gospels, particularly to this episode, continuing in the Gospel of Philip. And it's a lot of short little sayings and verses, parables and stuff that are expounding upon the ideas of what the Valentinian Gnostics believe. As I said before, if you've been following the show, we first had done Sethian Gnosticism, and now we're into Valentinian Gnosticism, which is a different branch, but they share a lot of the same ideas and their belief. Now, I wanted to take a moment to point out, before we dive more into the Gospel of Philip perspective, and I think it's important to emphasize this idea again, that as I'm presenting the Gnostic Gospels, particularly as I said, the Gospel of Philip today, it's insight into how the Gnostics thought, or how they seem to think, specifically about Jesus and what they were hearing him say and interpreting what he was saying. These Gospels, in a lot of ways, are expounding upon what they're interpreting, the meaning of what Jesus is saying. And the reason why this is very interesting and very relevant is because, again, as a point of interest, you've got two distinctively different groups. The Orthodox Christianity that we're all familiar with today, which is the front runner, the precursor to the development to the organized church, and the Gnostics and the different branches of Gnosticism. They were looking at the same teachings, but getting decidedly different understandings from the teachings, particularly from Jesus. And so they got two distinctively different messages from what Jesus was saying. And this is important because, as I said, it turns out in some ways it can be reduced to the idea of version. The version that won out and the version that actually kind of like faded into obscurity, and we might never have known much about if it weren't for, say, for instance, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1947 and the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were a few that were found independently. The Gospel of Mary, I believe, and the Gospel of Judas was discovered, I think, in the 1980s. But much of this stuff could have very well been lost to history. And it offers a very interesting glimpse into a particular branch that saw Jesus a particular way, and they interpreted his teachings a particular way. Now, as I move forward through this episode with the Gospel of Philip, the authors, Willis Barnstone and Marvin Myers, again, PhD scholars of the New Testament studies and the Old Testament, will have written into the footnotes, as I'm reading some of these sections, sayings that were actually, you'll find in the four Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. That's significant because, again, as these Gnostics were looking at the teachings of Jesus, many of the teachings that you'll find in the New Testament, in the four Gospels, and things that were said by Jesus, and these groups are hearing what he was saying very differently. And I've got actually a lot of examples today of just that phenomena. So as I go into it, I believe I left off with the three Marys. And it's just a short little excerpt that says, three Marys walked with the Lord, or Jesus. His mother, his sister, and Mary of Magdala, his companion. His sister and his mother and companion were Mary. This is another section that, not unlike, I think, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene and the Gospel of Thomas, where there was a couple of different Gnostic sources that claimed that Mary Magdalene was the companion of Jesus. And a companion, again, was used interchangeably with the word wife or spouse. So the Gnostics, again, a split from the Orthodoxy, believed that Jesus was actually involved with Mary Magdalene, and they were a couple. So, as I had pointed out in the book, there's sections and sayings, parables and stuff. Some are shorter, some are longer. And what I was able to glean from and kind of like deconstruct as I tried to figure out what I thought they were trying to say, there are certain things that jumped out. I'm not going to read every one for the sake of expediency so that we can actually move through the Gospels. But some of the ones that seem to jump out in some of their sayings, I have like a list of what I thought would be interesting and thought-provoking to talk about, and what the Gnostic perspective was. And one of them was starting with what is called blinders. And the short little saying, your teaching is, even evil powers serve the saints. The Holy Spirit blinds the powers, who suppose they are treating a simple man when they are treating a saint. Now, in some ways, this idea of a blinded power, thinking they're treating a simple man when they're actually treating a saint, could very well not be traced back to, but it seems to fall within the arena. There's a Jewish mystical saying of, be mindful and be careful for whoever you meet, because they may be Elijah in disguise. And I thought the blinders thing was pretty interesting to expound upon, because what it's really doing to the Gnostic student, the person that's pursuing Gnosticism, is to say, be mindful of every person that you meet, and don't be quick to dismiss them out of hand, because they may have something to teach you, or there may be a reason that you've met this particular person. Don't be too quick to judge and dismiss or categorize, because they may actually be Elijah in disguise. And it's a fanciful way of putting things. Of course, Elijah was a great prophet in the Jewish history, in the Jewish teachings. But to admonish the Gnostic student to beware of whoever they meet, because they may be Elijah in disguise, is meant to give them pause, to actually stop and actually listen to whoever that they might meet, and pay attention to maybe some of the things that the person that they might meet is presenting to them, for the potentiality to acquire more gnosis, or more understanding, more wisdom, life experience, which is, again, one of the fundamental roots of the Gnostic belief system and moving back towards God. So moving forward with that, and actually, this actually builds on the next premise, or not, this is part and parcel of the overall building blocks that make up the Gnosticism. One of the next sections I saw that really jumped out at me was something called Sophia and salt. Now, it begins with, the messenger said to the students, and the messenger, of course, is Jesus, let our offerings all be for obtaining salt. Salt is what they call Sophia. Without salt, no offering is acceptable. But Sophia is barren. She has no child, and so she is called a trace of salt. Yet wherever others are will be the Holy Spirit. Her children are many. Now, again, being building blocks for Gnosticism, if the basic system is built upon the idea that gnosis will bring you closer to God, which, i.e., life experience, what you're willing to do with your life, and go out and explore the world so that you can gain wisdom. In the ancient world, Sophia, setting aside the deification of and the mythology that is found in the Genesis narrative of the Gnostic Gospels, Sophia is actually called wisdom. Sophia is wisdom in the ancient understanding, or in the ancient tongue. I think it's translated from the Greek. Sophia means wisdom. Also called salt. Now, the reason why I bring this up in this idea of like the context of interpretation, in Mark 9:49, where Jesus said, if salt loses its flavor, it cannot be made salty again, or you will be salted with fire. Again, this saying, when looked at from an Orthodox standpoint, means one thing, but to a Gnostic it means the master, the messenger, the teacher. Jesus is saying, become salted, seek wisdom, seek understanding. So they're looking at something in the first gospel of Mark, not the first part of the gospel, but the first gospel, because Mark is largely regarded to be the first of the four gospels. And reading this idea of salt losing its flavor or becoming salted with fire, and the Gnostics are interpreting in one particular way, he's saying go for wisdom. He's saying that you should become wise, you should acquire gnosis, you should grow in your understanding, and the Orthodoxy was interpreting it another way. And that's one of the first points. Moving on to like some of the other points, and as I said, there's some things I'm skipping over because they have like a lot of metaphoric content to it that, sometimes it's best to argue back and forth over the metaphoric content of the deeper metaphoric content of what some of these mean. Like one of them is domestic animals and beasts, and it's saying that domestic animals may be bulls and donkeys and other species. Others are wild and live in the desert. A man plows a field with a domestic animal and from the fruit of his labor. He feeds himself and the animals, tame or wild. Compare the perfect human. Through submissive powers he plows and prepares for everything to come into being. So the world holds together, good or evil, the right and the left. The Holy Spirit shepherds everyone and rules all the powers. Those tame and wild and running loose. He gathers them and shuts them in, so, like it or not, they cannot escape. So, we could wax philosophically and metaphorically about the content of what the domestic animals mean, or the bull or donkey means, or what the perfect man means, and plowing the field, and all those different aspects of reading these and the metaphoric content to them. But instead of getting mired down in each one of the sections, I thought it might be best, because as I said, the viewer at home, if you have an interest in finding the Gnostic Gospels, Willis Barnstone and Marvin Meyer, this book, you can find it in the bookstore, and you can peruse it yourself for the particular sections that I may have passed over, that I just don't feel like we should get. I should get it too convoluted in what I'm trying to present in the Gnostic Gospels. So the next one that I want to move on to was a section called Seeing. It's just simply called Seeing. And it begins with, it is impossible to see anything in the real realm unless you become it. Not so in the world. You see the sun without becoming the sun. See sky and earth, but are not them. This is the truth of the world. In the other truth, you are what you see. If you see spirit, you are spirit. If you look at the anointed, or Jesus, the Christ, you are the anointed. If you see the Father, you will be the Father. In this world, you see everything but yourself. But there you look at yourself and are what you see. Now, the reason why I thought that this is really interesting to expound upon, and actually very provocative, is because of John 10:30 and John 7:58, where we have, I actually should have marked it off, make it a little bit easier instead of making you wait at home. John 10:30. In John 10:30, nope, no, that's not it. 7. Please excuse me for making you wait. In John 10:30, Jesus says, "I and my Father are one." And so a statement like that is actually a declaration of deity. For many Christians, the Orthodox Christians, that is Jesus saying, "I am God." And so that's one of the declarations of why the Orthodox Christianity is the religion to follow, because the man is saying, "I am God." He's claiming he's claiming deity. Jesus is saying, "I am God." Now you go to John 7:58. John 7, verse 58. Let's say I missed it. Well, it looks like I did, and I wrote it down wrong. Yeah, I think I probably did. I'm sorry. But it's the idea of the declaration of Jesus saying, I and the Father are one. Or Jesus saying, "I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the truth, the light, and the way." Now, again, it's interpretation. In previous shows, I had pointed out that to many Gnostics, the Sethian Gnostics and other Gnostics, the Gospel of John, the last Gospel, the Johannine Gospel, is, in the New Testament, is considered by Gnostics a very, very Gnostic Gospel in what it's saying. What makes it very interesting is interpretation again. For Orthodox Christianity, Jesus is claiming to be the deity, and it's submission to the will of accepting the Lord Jesus Christ as Savior, the blood of his sacrifice to save a life. To the Gnostic, and this idea of seeing, if you see spirit, you are spirit. If you look at the anointed, you are the anointed. If you see the Father, you will be the Father. So when Jesus is saying, "I and the Father are one," and I am the Alpha and the Omega. For the Gnostics, they're saying that the master or the teacher went through the process of gaining the gnosis, and he became the Father in his seeing and in his experience. And he laid out the pathway for us also to follow, so that we too become the Father. We too become I and the Father are one. We too become I am the Christ. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I know it's very provocative, and some might even say blasphemous, but and of course this is why there would be a lot of division, and there was a lot of persecution for some of these Gnostics in their interpretation of what Jesus was trying to teach. Because in the Orthodoxy, one couldn't claim to be God; only Jesus could claim to be the Son of God, because we were all inherently flawed because of sin. The Gnostics were saying that's nonsense. The master, the teacher, was saying that he, in his seeing, became the Spirit. He became the anointed because he saw the anointed. He became the Father because he saw the Father. He became the things that he saw, and he was teaching that we can become these things too. And I just thought it was really interesting, again, reading John and having two very different interpretations of what the central theme of his message was. Now, as I move forward, and I'm going to go to the one actually came across, the names of Jesus, really, really cool, really controversial. Again, some might even say blasphemous, but in my mind, very, very thought-provoking in its appeal to the Gnostic perspective. So it begins with the names of Jesus. The messengers who were before us had three names. And they put this in the plural. That's interesting. For him, Jesus the Nazarene Messiah. That is, Jesus the Nazarene, the Christ. The last name is Christ. The first name is Jesus. The middle name is the Nazarene. And here's where it gets very interesting. Messiah has two meanings: Christ or measured. Measured. Jesus in Hebrew means redemption. Nazareth, N-A-Z-A-R-A, or the shortened tense of Nazarene, Nazareth, is truth. Christ had been measured. The Nazarene and Jesus are they who have been measured. And I had to pull out my handy-dandy dry erase board because I thought that was really cool and how it was broken down, and I wanted to give a visual representation. And again, this is, in many ways, what the Gnostic was hearing in these particular things and why they expounded upon it. So you've got Jesus, Nazarene, Christ, or Jesus the Nazarene, that is the Christ. Now, Messiah has two meanings, as I had said, as it's written in here. It means either Christ or measured. Jesus is Hebrew for redemption, and Nazareth, the short form of Nazarene, means truth. When you take these three things together, of measured, of redemption, and truth, in his name, what's being presented to the Gnostic is the idea that Jesus was measured by the truth that he kept. Jesus was measured and redeemed by the truth that he knew. That's actually really incredibly thought-provoking. It was based on the idea of wisdom, not any act of crucifixion that made him cross the threshold, or anointing, being baptized so that the dove descended from the heaven. Not a singular act that turned him into a deity, but a measured act of the truth that he had acquired is what redeemed him. And for the Gnostic, Jesus laid out a pathway so that every person could become redeemed through the truth that they had been measured by. We're all measured by it, and in some ways it actually goes and falls into the arena of, and this is post-life in Egyptian mythology, the idea that the soul stands before, I believe it's Osiris, and it's measured, the human soul and what it has done is measured against the feather of Ma'at, M-A-A-T, and if your soul is lighter than the feather, you can pass into paradise. But if it's heavier than a feather, you are you were devoured by a hippopotamus-esque alligator, kind of, I forgot what the beast is called. But the allegorical content of that story is, or behind it, questions a person is supposed to ask is, the soul is supposed to be lighter than the feather. What does that mean? You know, in its context, and what the person is, or the person has become, the person has acquired through their lifetime and passing into death, so that their soul would be heavier or lighter against a feather. It's a measuring of where a person is in their understanding. In the Gnostic mysticism and the Gnostic teaching here expounded upon in the Gospel of Philip, every person that speaks gnosis, every person that seeks gnosis, will be measured and redeemed by the truth that they have acquired. They will become Jesus, the Nazarene Christ, every person who seeks this gnosis. Agree with it, disagree with it. I know it's provocative. I know it could be, like I said, blasphemous, but this is what the Gnostics believe, and I think it's pretty interesting because they put the onus on the individual person to cultivate gnosis and cultivate wisdom, to make their heart or their spirit light, as I said, against the feather of ma'at. So that was my one time today in the program where I'll actually use my handy-dandy dry erase board before I move on to some of the next sections. Now, this idea of the names of Jesus and the fact that one is redeemed through the wisdom that they've acquired. It's a vague notion, an idea that can't usually be measured. Something that we're all familiar with in the Judeo-Christian world that we're raised in. The idea that we have a soul or that we have a spirit. But for those that become more skeptical, they start asking questions. What does that mean? Where is it? How does it work? One of the next sections that jumped out at me was something called pearl in the mud. And in some ways it indirectly addresses this idea of this essential self, the consciousness, the I self, the soul, the spirit, whatever it is. And I think it puts in context, in some ways, a person's confidence that they have a right to seek this gnosis, that this gnosis is available to everyone. There is no inherent deficiency in any person that would stop them from being able to pursue this gnosis. So the idea of the next section called Pearl in the Mud is, if a pearl is thrown into the mud, it loses no value. If it is rubbed with balsam oil, it gains no value. It always is precious in its owner's eyes. Wherever they are, the children of God are precious in the eyes of the Father. So in some ways, I think what they're saying about this idea of either the consciousness or, say for instance, more organically, the basic state of the person, whether one is thrown into the mud in sickness and in poverty, disease, or one is rubbed with balsam oil, which is a sign of wealth and prosperity and opulence. Wherever you are, whatever your station is in life, wherever you stand, the inherent nature of yourself, the pearl, its value isn't affected either way. And the only thing that affects its inherent, I wouldn't say affects its inherent, enhances its inherent nature and moves it towards God, or moves it towards cleaving to the Father, or becoming the I am that I am, is the pursuit of gnosis. Again, this is built upon the Gnostic theme. They seem to be saying a couple of different things in this little section. Like, again, the essential self, the I self, the I am that I am, the Christ self is the pearl. And it's not affected by any physical, it's not elevated, it's not overvalued or devalued by any physical premise of poverty and disease and wanting on one side, or opulent wealth on the other side. The pearl is as the pearl is. And you can enhance the pearl and move towards cleaving to God by the pursuit of gnosis. So I thought that was pretty interesting to point out. There's a provocative one that I wanted to actually address, and it says in the forward to this section in the Gospel of Philip that actually it mentioned this actual part that made the Gospel of Philip so provocative, and it's called "God is a man-eater," and I'll go into a little bit of the detail of it, but again, it's so rich in metaphoric content in the directions that it could go into that I don't want to get mired down. Just touch upon a couple of points of what they, at least for my take, what they seem to be saying in such a statement like this: God is a man-eater. And it begins with, God is a man-eater, so people are sacrificed to him. Before humans were sacrificed, it was animals. Because those they were eaten by were not gods. It's interesting, almost like perhaps a Gnostic admonishment, because the Jewish history is rich in the idea of sacrifice, ritual sacrifice of a lamb, a ram, a bull, doves, pigeons, and the Gnostics may be saying that, and this actually give JC the credit for this, this idea of your God is too small. They're sacrificing animals, but they're sacrificing an animal to something that wasn't God. They were sacrificing the animals to the air. They're sacrificing animals to the ether. They're doing a useless exercise. When they say that God is a man-eater, and then you couple this with the idea of, that is, again, it's expressed again in some mystical teachings in other branches in the world, whether it's the annihilation of self in Zen Buddhism, or shamanic death in Toltec shamanism, or the crucifixion, the Jesus experience when he died on the cross. It's what they might call the mortification of the flesh. God is a man-eater because I think from the Gnostic's point of view, the truest way to approach God was the sacrifice of self, the sacrifice of the identity of what we think we are. That's the truest and only real sacrifice that there is. Not an animal, not a bird, not a bull, not a ram, not any of these different things, but the sacrifice of self upon the cross of self. So, and that is the truest sacrifice. And that's what makes God a man-eater. And as I said, like it could be, again, construed as blasphemous. It could be as dark and violent. But sometimes you have to try and dig past the initial statement to see what the underlying theme might be. And then in some ways it's got a softening effect to where you're kind of like, all right, you agree or disagree with it. It's pretty interesting. The next section I want to read was just essentially about, it seems to be about just touching upon the idea of life experience and variety of experience. It's called The Donkey and the Millstone. And it begins with, a donkey turning a millstone walked 100 miles. When it was set loose, it found itself in the same place. Some people travel long but go nowhere. At twilight, they have seen no cities or villages, no human constructions or phenomena of nature, no powers or angels. These miserable ones have labored in vain. So, again, part of the Gnostic maxim is the richness of a life experience and what you're willing to experience in your life, and the gaining of gnosis is the keys to heaven. But if one is a slave to the dogmas of the ritual, the religion that you find yourself in, it is no variation on your life experience. You get up at the same time every day, you go to work and you do the same job, you're married to the same person for 50 years, and you've got no variety of experience in your life that brings new experiences in that garner you the chance to be able to gain gnosis, then you're no more than in many ways a donkey tied to a mill. You'll walk 100 miles, but you'll still be in the same place. So, because I think, it seems to me that the Gnostics placed a premium on the idea of in the rich experience of life, and exploring wide and deep, and all the different people that you might meet and all the different experiences you might have, lies the key to being able to understand God. And it was up against an orthodoxy that had formulated an idea that we have inherent sin and we need to be redeemed, and there's a set of laws that need to be followed, and there's rules that need to be obeyed, and there's ritual that needs to be followed, and all these things, it seems from a Gnostic perspective, have a deadening effect on the human consciousness. They have a deadening effect on human awareness in how we treat each other, what our expectations are, our ability to be open up to new experiences. And so we stay within, and it was in earlier earlier texts, I believe it was the Sethian ones, this idea of this fog of fear and terror, this fog of fear and terror that we find ourselves in, and we're perpetually bound in chains, as Jesus had said in the secret gospel of John when he was inferring about reincarnation. This routine keeps us dull in our senses. It keeps us immersed in this fog. And the Gnostics are more or less saying that you must free yourself from being the donkey in the millstone, walking 100 miles but learning nothing new, having any different or new experiences. You have to find the keys to heaven, as it were. And for them, gnosis was the key. And Jesus seemed to, for them, was all about that gnosis. This one, again, another really, really thought-provoking one that I thought was really cool. And again, it's based upon interpretation, again, of Jesus' relationship with Mary. As the Orthodox believe that Mary Magdalene was the redeemed prostitute, many Gnostics believe that Mary was the companion of Jesus or the wife of Jesus, so she was nothing. The idea of her being a redeemed prostitute that had angels or demons in her has no truth to it. So, again, taking these characters, and this is a Gnostic slant on what they thought Mary Magdalene's relationship to Jesus was, and in relation to the apostles. And I thought it was pretty cool because if you read into it a little bit, at least as far as I read into it a little bit, and felt as if I was interpreting what was going on in tone of voice, I thought it was pretty cool. So, wisdom, mother of the angels. It begins with, wisdom, who is called barren, is the mother of the angels. The companion is Mary of Magdala. Jesus loved her more than his students. He kissed her often on her face, more than all of his students. And they said, "Why do you love her more than us?" The Savior answered, saying to them, "Why do I love her? Why do I not love you like her? If a blind man and one who sees are together in darkness, they are the same. When the light comes, the one who sees will see light. The blind man stays in the darkness." Now, here's where I think it gets very interesting if one gets into inflection, of what seems to be being said. Now, when I read that part where he says, why do I love her more than you? Or why do I not love you like her? When Jesus said, why do I not love you like her? I read it more monotone. But as I'm reading it and I'm kind of mulling over it, you could also change the inflection to them asking Jesus, well, why do you love her more than you love us? And Jesus going, why do I love her more than I love you? Really? I have to explain this to you guys? It seems that Jesus was saying that they were like blind men. And again, this is based upon the Gnostic premise. There's a richness. One of the richest experiences that any human can have is their experience with the opposite sex. Through marriage, through love, sometimes through parenthood, through the mother-son relationship or the father-daughter relationship, whatever it is. But Jesus was saying, essentially, he seemed to be saying, are you kidding me? Really? I've got to explain to you guys why I love her more than I love you? He was trying to point out to them that the gnosis that he achieved, that he acquired through his relationship with her, the insights that he was able to achieve through his walk through life with her were deeper and richer and varied in so many different directions that he can't get from a relationship with another man, with an apostle. And he was more or less admonishing them to open their eyes and see why it made so much sense, why he loved her more than he loved them. Now, again, I know that this is runs contrary to the Orthodox perspective, because Jesus was thought to be a man who, because he was a deity, what need would he have for marriage? What need would he have for sex? All these different things, where the Gnostics thought, well, no, he was a man, and there's probably a really good chance he was married, because from a sociological perspective back then, sort of talking 2,000 years ago in the area of Judea, it would have been highly unusual. Now, I've heard different scholars talk about this, and they argue back and forth about the veracity of this idea or this statement, putting it in a religious sociological perspective. I happen to fall on the side that believes that it would be highly unusual for a man to have been unmarried by the time Jesus started his ministry. He probably would have been betrothed. He probably would have had, like, you know, in their Jewish tradition, in their social, religious, economic makeup of the area, men got married, women got married when they came to age. To remain unmarried was an anomaly. And there's a really good chance that Jesus would have been married or betrothed or at least had a companion even before he started his ministry. It seems like it's common sense, but again, there's those on the other side that argue that being the Messiah or being the Son of God or being God, he would have no need for those particular things. There's no evidence for the fact that he would have had a companion, etc., etc. But when one, again, follows it through the Gnostic vein of the idea of experiential, without being redundant, the experiences of life and the richness of the variances of experience of life are the rich loom of gnosis. You know, your willingness to fall in love and share life with someone, and being able to put yourself secondary to the person that you love, as you would as a parent, or to think that you're thinking for somebody else now when you're married to them, and you have to think of their feelings and not just your own. And all these different facets that make us what we are as we mature into our adulthood garner so much wisdom and so much life experience that Jesus was pointing out that it was only common sense that he might love her more than he loved them, for what he was able to garner in the gnosis that he was able to acquire to grow into the Christ consciousness. This is what they seem to be saying in this particular part. And I thought it'd be really interesting to expound upon a bit. So I'm going to move on to the next part, which I thought was pretty interesting. Some of the ones I'm skipping over, like being or humans and animals, water and mystery, marriage, bridal chamber, leaving the world. There's a section called will and sin, which again has parallels to a section of the New Testament, particularly John section 8, verse 7. So I'm going to read will and sin, and then we can actually, I wanted to see if I could find that section because I thought it was really cool, and I had written a lot of notes about it. There it is. John 7:8. What is John 7:8? John 7:8. John chapter 7 verse 8 is, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." It's the story of the woman taken in adultery, and the people gather. They throw her at Jesus' feet, and they try to trick Jesus. That was. I ought to put my notes in better order. John chapter 8, verse 7. "He that is without sin amongst you, let him first cast a stone at her." And of course, the backstory is, well, let's see. I'll read will and sin first, and then I'll get into that. I don't want to make it, again, too convoluted and go in too many different directions. But and just being able to see what the reasoning is of how I was, thinking of linking these two ideas together. One from the Gospel of Philip, and then that section of John 8:7. So will and sin is, "It is good to leave the world before one has sinned. Some have neither the will nor the ability to act. Others, even if they have the will, are better off. If they do not act, for the act of the will makes them sinners. But even if they do not have will to act, justice may be concealed from them. Whether they have the will or not, will, not action, is always primary." Now, the reason why this jumped out at me, this idea of "let he who is without sin cast the first stone," is because the root of every person is the will. And from the will springs our judgments and our rules of what we think we should and shouldn't do, what we think is fair and what we think is unfair. And in a lot of ways, it's also, and Jesus pointed this out a lot in his ministry, because he was always admonishing those that followed the law, saying you're missing the forest despite the trees. He was pointing out that when you follow the law so closely as an expression of your own will, of what you think, the way things should be. I pointed out on a previous show that the Gnostics are pointing out that a person's perspective on God oftentimes is the way that they want God to be, not necessarily the essential nature of what God was. The Gnostics understood this idea, so they were constantly pushing the idea and saying that God can be not be defined. But for those who suffer under, for lack of a better way to put it, an orthodox belief, in their mind, they firmly established what they think the will of God is, expressed through the law and all these different things. So you get this angry mob of people that shows up, and they throw this woman at Jesus' feet, and they say, we caught her in adultery, what should we do with her? And of course, they were trying to trick him. They knew that if Jesus had said, forgive her, following his idea of forgiveness and love, he would be violating the law of Moses because he wouldn't be following it, and they could hold it against him. But if he said, stone her, follow the law, they would say that he was being a hypocrite because he wasn't following his teaching of being loving and compassionate. So they tried to trick him. Jesus stooped down on the ground, he started writing on the ground, and said, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. Now, the richness to this, I thought it was really cool and really interesting, is that the will of these people and what sprung from the will of these people, their thoughts, their judgments, the cruelty that, because again, the will being the root of the person, and in a lot of ways that's the crux of the problem, because, and without using the word altruism, but to use the basic idea, the basic premise that when Buddha said, I see Buddhas everywhere, or Jesus said about the idea of becoming the Christ, many of these great avatars in history, whether it was Jesus or Krishna or Lao Tzu or Buddha, were pointing out the idea that you must strive to see yourself in everyone and everyone in yourself, and make that the focal point of your will. And through the guarding of gnosis and having wide and varied experiences, you grow in that compassion. That's the root to compassion. The root to compassion is your ability to be able to see yourself in everyone else and everyone else in you. But if your will is set upon the idea that you understand what you think that the will of God is, and it's expressed through the law, and expressed through the ritual or the sacrifice, when one violates your idea of what you think the law is supposed to be, then you can even gleefully, malevolently, sadistically stone them. You can do anything that you want to them because they are now other. They've fallen outside of the perimeters of your idea of what you think the approach to God is, so they don't deserve the consideration to be saved or to be redeemed. So, the mob mentality, throw her down, stone her, kill her. The bloodlust rises in people, and they will gleefully, again, stone her to death to satisfy that bloodlust. And Jesus was saying, let he who's without sin cast the first stone. And of course, as the story goes, one by one, they all looked at themselves and they realized they were being hypocrites and they walked away. And the point is that I touched upon the idea that at its root, it's the will and sin. Because again, sin being interpreted two different ways. Sin for the Gnostic was to miss the mark, to mire yourselves in that confusion that causes a fear and terror, that causes you to do these cruel things, these ugly things, these things that keep you in that cycle of darkness. When you correct this sin through gnosis, you wake up. And through the seeking of compassion and love and patience with each other, through the Gnostic process, one grows into God. Jesus was pointing out that you think that you're pious to the Orthodox. You think that you're pious, following the rules and the laws like you think you're supposed to, but you're still mired in sin. and it's causing you to be cruel. It's causing you to be indifferent. It's causing you to make many others suffer to follow what your will of, what you think the proper interpretation of approach to God is. And I thought that that was really interesting. And just to put a neat little bow on it, importantly, it is important to point out the last part of this section, this parable of the woman, is more in what Jesus didn't say or didn't do than what he did. He says, he looked up at one point and there was only him and her left. He says, is there no one left to condemn you? She said, no. He said, then neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. What did Jesus do? He didn't condemn her. What is unsaid? He didn't forgive her either. The point is, Jesus neither condemned nor forgave her. He just let her be as she was, not projecting his will upon her, a Gnostic premise, in what he thought the right way or the wrong way was to be. He just said, go and sin no more, or, miss the mark no more. It's important to point out that he didn't forgive her either. He was neutral in it, and he was, and that's it. That's an important distinction between judging or forgiving. Because when you judge, you're applying a measure to another person. When you forgive, you're also applying another measure to a person. They could be just as dangerous sometimes as betraying a person with condemnation. So I got about 10 minutes left. Move on that section, and a few more parts to see if I can get through, because actually the Gospel of Philip turned out to be pretty big, and it's actually long, and so I've been trying to work my way through it so that I can, again, so I don't get mired too much. The next section I want to read a little bit on or touch on is called Truth and Nakedness. And it begins with, truth didn't come into the world naked, but in types, in images. Truth is received only that way, in types and images. There's rebirth and its image. They must be reborn through image. What is the resurrection? Image must rise again through image. The bridegroom and image enter through the image into truth, which is restored. It is right that those who don't have it take on the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, but they have not done so on their own. If you do not take on the names for yourself, the name Christian will be taken from you. And again, taking on the names yourself, and the three names that I just talked about, the Jesus, the Nazarene, and the Christ. So a lot of the themes just seem to be interwoven with each other. If you do not take on the names yourself, the name Christian will be taken from you. You receive them in oil and in chrism, which is a blessing of oil. The aromatic unction of the power of the cross. The messenger called this power the right and the left. You are no longer a Christian, but Christ. Now, again, parallels, reading, for the Gnostic to come to believe this, that a person through the images and this process goes from being a Christian to becoming Christ, when they read something like Matthew 10:38. So in Matthew 10:38, or Matthew chapter 10, verse 38, Jesus says, he that loveth, this is 37 and 38, he that loveth a father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth a son or the daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he that taketh not his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. So Jesus was saying that if you wish to follow me, you must pick up your own cross and you must carry it. Now, again, interpretation. When the Gnostics read something like this, the idea of truth and nakedness, and Jesus saying you have to pick up your cross and follow me, was Jesus pointing out that to become like me, to become the Christ like me, you must do what I do. It's not necessarily physical. Of course, it's not. It's absolutely not physical. The idea of being nailed physically to a cross, even though for the Orthodox the idea was redemptive in the sacrifice of the Lamb to wash away the sins of the world, for the Gnostics the idea was to carry your own cross, was to do the self-exploration, to go inside of the self, to deconstruct the self, to cultivate the compassion and the love and the patience and all those different things that turn the person into the Christ, so that the Gnosticism that they had learned turns them into Jesus, Nazarene Christ, or the one, you, me, any other person who was redeemed by the measure of truth that we carried. You become the name, as it says here in the Truth and Nakedness. This is how the Gnostics would interpret it. Very different from what, say for instance, the Orthodox would interpret in Matthew 10:38. So I have, I think, 5 minutes. I have about 5 minutes left. There's certain things that I really want to get into, but I think that I've run out of time. So I'm going to take these last 5 minutes to actually go back a little bit and touch upon the whole thing about let he who is without sin cast the first stone. No, I'm sorry. The Good Samaritan. For one reason or another, as I was reading the Gnostic Gospels, and the idea that you should be kind to every person that you meet, because you never know when you're going to meet Elijah in disguise. And just to wrap the show up with this idea, it seems to be a Gnostic perspective. The idea of being kind to every person that you meet, or every stranger you meet, because you don't know whether or not to be Elijah in disguise, and the idea of the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the Good Samaritan, of course, is the person that had helped a man and bound his wounds and took care of him after he was beaten and robbed when other people passed him by. The Gnostic idea is, and the idea of cultivating gnosis through experience. And I'm going to put it in more of a contemporary theme. There is a movie that was made within the last 10 or 15 years called Crash. It's varying stories told of a bunch of people in L.A. You know, I think a mayor, a couple of police officers, one guy was a music mogul, and it dealt with a bunch of different things. One amongst them was racism. At one point in the movie, and Matt Dillon is in the movie, he's one of the cops, the actor Matt Dillon. Well, he's a racist cop in the movie, and his partner wasn't. And they make two distinctly different choices at the end of the movie. But I'm only going to point out Matt Dillon's choices as I expound upon the idea. At one point in the movie, he pulls over a black couple. The husband is I believe he's the music mogul, and his wife is, they're very affluent, they're very well-to-do. And Matt Dillon, being a racist, gives them a really hard time, and draws a lot of ire from them, and makes them, make this black couple deal with this kind of like contemptible racism. And as you go through the story, it's pointed out how Matt Dillon became to where he was in his racist ideas. At the end of the movie, the wife, the black wife that had been with her husband and experiences racism from Matt Dillon, the cop, is in an accident, and her vehicle is flipped over and it's on fire. And he ends up getting to the scene. As he gets to the scene, he runs over to the car and he climbs in, and he tries to start pulling her out because she was seatbelted in. Well, when she saw who it was, she started yelling, no, get away from me, because she saw that it recognized it was the racist cop that had given her and her husband so much problems. But he's practically begging her, please let me help you. Please let me get you out of the car. Please let me help you. And he was actually pulled out by the other cops. He pushed the other cops away and struggled back into the car and actually got her out of the car and dragged her out. And then the scene cuts where both of them are sitting there staring off into space. He's sitting in one section near where the car is burnt, and she's sitting in another section. And what really jumped out at me was this idea, in paralleling the Good Samaritan, and the idea of the Gnostic pursuit. Matt Dillon's character was portrayed as a racist in the movie, a racist cop. The main point, the main takeaway from what happened in the movie was, At that point of trauma, at that point of suffering, at that point of pain that one person was seeing another person experience, all those things went out the window. The idea of being a racist, the idea of hating other people or being a sexist or being any one of these different things ceased to matter for Matt Dillon at that moment. He saw another person suffering, and he tried to alleviate the pain that a person was suffering. He may go back to being a racist. It doesn't matter. The point is, at that moment of awareness, none of those things mattered. He just saw another person suffering. And this is, in a lot of ways, what seems to be the root of the parable of the Good Samaritan. It didn't matter what the person was. It didn't matter if the person was a Macedonian, or if they were from Magdalene, or if they were a Canaanite, or what it was. The Samaritan saw another person suffering and responded to that suffering. Where others looked at him and judged him and weighed him and said, he's not one of us, pass him by. The Samaritan said, none of those things matter. The only thing that matters is that at this moment, this person's suffering, and that suffering needs to be alleviated. I think that it's a good measure to live by. And I think that in some ways it was perhaps how some of the Gnostics saw things too. I've run out of time. I was able to get through many of the sections I wanted to with these parts of Philip in the Gnostic Gospels. I will see if I could actually finish for the next episode, and then we'll move on to some of the other sections before we move on to, I believe we may be doing an author named Joseph Campbell, if I could get my co-producer JC to come back. I'd like to thank you for joining us for another episode. Hopefully you'll join us for the next episode of Not to Shoot Down, and we'll see if we can wrap up the Gospel of Philip. Mark, thank you. Good night.